My family moved into a house in Orem when I was 6 years old, over 40 years ago. I was too young to remember, so most of what happened was told to me by my mother. We bought the house for a surprisingly low price. The house still had some furniture in it from the previous owners. The neighbors told us that the house's previous owners had a young son who had mental issues. He was 7 to 8 years old but couldn't talk. One day he went missing. They looked everywhere, formed a neighborhood search and got the police involved. The police finally found the child who had crawled behind the dryer in the laundry room and gotten electrocuted. His body was found crumpled behind the dryer and had been there the entire time they were searching for him. Staying at the house was too painful for them, so they quickly moved, leaving his bed, a couple of couches, and an antique radio. We threw out everything but the radio, which we set up in the living room as a centerpiece. It was an early radio with vacuum tubes and dials. After living there for a few months, my mother was woken up by a loud noise. She followed the sound into the living room where the radio was. It had turned itself on in the middle of the night. She turned it off and went to sleep. A few nights later, it turned itself on again and my mother went into the room to turn it off. It wasn't tuned to a station, the sound was all static. As she reached to turn it off, she heard the sound of a child crying coming from the radio. She thought that it may be a radio drama from another station that somehow made a sound in the static. A few weeks later the same thing happened, and it was the same child's voice crying. She felt spooked out and unplugged the radio. We left it unplugged after that. One day my aunt, who didn't know about the history of the radio, came over to stay for a few days. She saw the radio was unplugged and plugged it back in, thinking she was doing us a favor. She was staying in our living room and was awoken that night by the sound of a child crying. It scared the hell out of her. She woke up my mother and they turned the radio off and unplugged it. They stayed up talking about the history of the house and the radio. They decided to get rid of the radio the next day because they felt it was haunted and they were hearing the cries of the child who couldn't talk over the airwaves. The house felt a lot better after the radio was removed, but they noticed when the trash was taken out later that week that the radio had been taken from the top of the trash pile. It was sitting on top of the rest of the trash. Someone had seen the cool-looking radio and taken it from our garbage can. Somewhere out there, that haunted radio is probably part of someone's collection, and if it's plugged in, the child who died in that house might be heard crying again.
Thank you for sharing the story with us. I couldn't imagine how the parents of that poor child felt. I wonder if the child used to sit by the radio a lot listening to different broadcasts and that's why he was drawn to it. If that radio is still out there, I wonder, can they still hear the cries to this day? Well, Damian, glad to see you are dedicated to finding people's secrets. How many years back do you think is far enough? The harder you dig, and the more time you waste to find that which isn't there, will only cause you frustration. When will you realize that,